Hey everyone, before jumping into the conversation today, I just wanted to let you know that we're going to discuss some pretty sensitive topics, including suicide, self-harm, and systemic violence. Please take care of yourself listening, and if you need to access any resources, you can find French and English resources in the description below. Take care and enjoy the chat. Hello, everybody. Hello. I'm pleased to welcome Alexandre Baril today, Associate Professor at the University of Ottawa's School of Social Work. Professor Baril is the author of numerous books and articles on transphobia, ableism, linguistic politics, critical suicidology, philosophy, feminism, and so many other things. It seems like there's just an endless array of things you cover. And today we're talking, though, about his new book titled Undoing Suicidism in the English version. The French version is going to be called Défaire le Suicidisme, and that will be available. It'll be finally translated in a few weeks, coming out in early May, the French version. But this one, currently the English version, you can access via a link in the description of both the YouTube video, if you're watching this on YouTube, or of the podcast. So you can check that out there. And there will also be a French version adapted to European French speakers in 2026. So stay tuned for that in case you're in Europe and want a French version that happens to, adapt to that language. Now, then without further ado, I'd like to welcome Alexandre Baril.
Hi.
But yeah, I mean, just to start out, how we'll do this is just we'll go through some questions and we'll give some pretty elaborate answers to each. Oh, and one more thing. For those people who want to listen in French, la version française, ça sera disponible sur la même chaîne YouTube. Tu peux le trouver, c'est la même titre, mais en français. So if you wanted to find it in French, you can find it like that. But this will be the English version. So just to start, while it might seem like a simple question, your book's introductory chapter encouraged me to ask, what is suicide? Assisted suicide and medical assistance in dying. How are these things different? And would you say that the term suicide is a culturally charged word always already used to deride some people's acts? Do you think that the term can be reappropriated, or should researchers begin employing different language altogether to describe death by choice?
Well, I don't think they are a simple question, and I think it's always a great idea to start with some definitions. So I would even include a fourth term to define, that is suicidality. And suicidality is a broad term encompassing three things: suicidal ideations, suicide attempts, and completed suicide. Suicide is therefore comprised in the larger notion of suicidality. According to critical psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, that maybe some of you know, suicide can be defined as the act of, and here I will quote Szasz, taking one's life voluntarily or deliberately, either by killing oneself directly or by abstaining from a directly life-saving act. So it's the definition I use in my book, and this definition is broad enough to include multiple kinds of self-accomplished death, be they active or passive, supported or not. In my book, I use the expression assisted suicide as an umbrella term encompassing various practices leading to voluntary death that are assisted, of course, either by offering the means to complete suicide, such as providing lethal drugs that are self-administered, or by providing euthanasia or medical assistance in dying. In some countries, such as Switzerland and some states in the US, healthcare professionals are prevented from participating in voluntary euthanasia. In these contexts, the person requesting support to die is provided with the knowledge and drug prescription they need to accomplish their suicide on their own. So in those cases, we can use the terms assisted death or assisted suicide, but not the term euthanasia or medical assistance in dying. In other countries, we can think about Belgium, Canada, the Netherlands, etc. Voluntary euthanasia is allowed. So in Canada, for example, the medical assistance in dying law distinguishes between clinician-administered medical assistance in dying and self-administered medical assistance in dying, and both forms are allowed. While numerous disputes pertain to the type of disability, sickness, and illness that make someone eligible for assisted death in various countries, the requests for assisted death made solely based on mental illness elicit the most controversy, even in the right to die movement, in fact. That brings me to insist on the fact that historically, assisted death, voluntary euthanasia, and medical assistance in dying have all been conceptualized as radically distinct from suicide. And this is why most of the current laws on assisted death, the term suicide is not used. People prefer to talk about end-of-life care, assistance in death, assistance in dying, or euthanasia, because those practices are seen as completely different than suicide, which should be prevented, of course. So as we can see, the term suicide remains very stigmatized and negative. The assumption that suicidality is a problem and nothing but a problem in need of a cure, be it medical or social, is reflected in this negative vocabulary used to discuss suicidality. And this is why a lot of people try to avoid the term suicide, even among those who don't condemn the practice. And this is the case of the philosopher Jean Amery, who in his book on suicide used the expression voluntary death. So in my work, I decided to retain the terms suicide and assisted suicide in the spirit of queer, disability, and crip politics, which have resignified words with negative connotations such as queer and crip, turning them into vectors of positivity that are foundational to political agendas and fields of study. Suicide is one of those terms that is negative, and I hope will eventually be seen in this new light, liberated from its usual links to pathologization, alienation, stigmatization, risk, and surveillance.
Yeah, and it certainly is this term that's is just imbued with so many negative qualities, and to try to, to reappropriate it, I think is extremely important. But what is suicidism? I mean, if we look at the title of the book itself, what is suicidism? And while you are clear that you don't know if opposing suicidism will necessarily translate into fewer suicides, how do you think that suicidism contributes to suicide? Why do you think that suicide is so threatening to the social body to encourage such oppressive suicidist treatments of suicidal people? And can you say more about how suicidism intersects with capitalism, patriarchy, heteronormativity and futurity, ableism, saneism, and ageism?
Yeah, so suicidism refers to the oppressive system that functions at the normative, medical, legal, social, political, economic, and epistemic levels, a system in which suicidal people experience multiple forms of injustice and violence, such as discrimination, stigmatization, exclusion, pathologization, and even forms of incarceration. So our society is replete with horrific stories of suicidal individuals facing inhuman treatments after expressing their suicidal ideations in order to save their lives at all costs, from being hospitalized and drugged against their will, to being handcuffed and shot by the police, to losing their jobs, to having their parental rights revoked, to even being kicked off university campuses. So because of these negative suicidist consequences, suicidal people remain silent and complete their suicide without reaching out for help. As I always say, every single completed suicide is the proof that what we are doing currently is not working, because each of these people did not call for help just before completing their suicide. So these stories illustrate that despite the supportive discourses surrounding suicidality, suicidal people who call for help do not find the promised support. And worse, I argue in the book that suicide prevention services do more harm than good. Simply put, suicide prevention often increases death by suicide rather than prevents them. So, and this is especially true for marginalized suicidal people, such as Indigenous, racialized, poor, queer, trans, disabled, neurodivergent, or mad people, for whom suicide intervention often increases the racist, colonialist, classist, sexist, heterosexist, cisgenderist, ableist, and sanist violence they experience. So, to give you just a few examples, emergency services and police officers won't react the same way if they are called to a suicide crisis, if the person involved is a white woman living in a wealthy neighborhood versus if the person is a Black man living in a poor neighborhood, or a neurodivergent person who panics during the intervention. So, as we can see with this example, suicidism is strongly interlocked with classism, racism, colonialism, heterosexism, ableism, and other forms of oppressions. Some community organizations, such as Trans LifeLine, who work with trans women, trans men, non-binary folks, argue, as I do in my work, that non-consensual rescues of suicidal people intensify suicidality due to the inhuman, harmful, and violent treatment imposed on suicidal marginalized subjects by the police and healthcare providers. Following some of their observations of Trans LifeLine, I identified a series of negative consequences associated with non-consensual rescues that affect specifically trans communities. And we can do this exercise for multiple marginalized groups. Here I do it for trans people. So, for example, those rescues often out trans people to their family or relatives, and such forms of outing can lead to further rejection, expulsion from home, and violence. Those rescues often involve fees, for example, ambulance, hospitalization fees, etc., for trans people who are already overrepresented in statistics on poverty. Additionally, involuntary hospitalization and histories of mental health issues and suicidality may negatively impact access to trans-affirmative healthcare by delaying or blocking care. Also, as we know, interactions with the healthcare system and social services often include stigmatization and violence for trans people. And finally, those rescues break the trust of potential hotline callers who may fear that the operators will initiate a non-consensual rescue. So in other words, a hotline that supports suicide prevention measures that are non-consensual, which is the case with 99.9% of hotlines in North America, does not elicit trust or confidence. As we can see here, transphobia or cisgenderism and suicidism reinforce each other. In short, rather than finding comfort, support, and care that they are looking for, many marginalized people experience discrimination, microaggression, trauma, and incarceration by reaching out for help, which seem counterproductive and completely unacceptable. So the thesis I put forth is that suicidal people are oppressed by suicidism and that the oppression they experience remains under-theorized. And I think it's important to give this oppression a name because naming the structural violence experienced by a group, and in this case, suicidal people, collectivizes and politicizes common experience of violence and allows suicidal people, as is the case with all the other marginalized groups, to denounce the systemic oppression they are experiencing and stop seeing it as an individual problem to solve through various cures. As I explain in the book, with the help of the framework of epistemic injustices coined by Miranda Fricker, not having terms and concepts with which to name oppression constitutes a form of hermeneutical injustice. So the oppression of suicidal people starts with this lack of concept or the epistemic scarcity surrounding suicidism, to the point of not even having a term with which to denounce it. So as a suicidal person myself, suicidism is the word I sought for years until I coined it around 2016. And the necessity for this concept is evidenced by the numerous emails I've received over the years from suicidal people telling me that they had been thinking about the oppression suicidal people face, but did not have a term to name it. And many suicidal individuals have written to me to express their gratitude for the fact that my work has provided them with theories and concepts that make sense of their very difficult experiences. And since the publication of my book, those emails, as you might imagine, keep multiplying. So they testify, I believe, to this need we have to create theoretical tools and concepts to help combat suicidism and, of course, its consequences on suicidal people.
Yeah, completely. I mean, to really stress the importance of giving words to things to make sense of people's experiences, specifically this one in which suicidal people are treated as, like you say, very much a problem, and therefore their humanity is kind of taken from them. And so, to me, one of the striking things about the way that you write this book is your willingness to confront an impossible enemy, and that is the supremacy of life over death. To think through the sociocultural privileging of life over death, you employ a few important terms, and some of these include soma technologies of life, compulsory aliveness, and the injunction to live. Could you expand on these terms to describe our sociocultural emphasis on life, that is, compulsory aliveness, and the strategies used to normalize aliveness, these soma technologies of life?
Yes, of course. So the concept of somatechnics, pardon me, was coined by Nikki Sullivan, and it refers to the interconnectedness of the body or soma and various technologies or techniques. As I demonstrate in my work, laws, practices, interventions, regulations, and discourses surrounding suicide and assisted suicide represent forms of soma technologies of life imposed upon suicidal subjects to stay alive. So I coined that expression to denounce, as you mentioned, the supremacy of life over death. And those soma technologies of life are present in almost all discourses and interventions on suicide and assisted suicide. I contend that by silencing suicidal people who fear to experience suicide as a violence if they reveal their suicidality, those soma technologies of life paradoxically constitute soma technologies of death that produce more distress and suicidal ideations. The concept of the injunction to live and to futurity I propose has been a core concept in my work for the last 10 years. And I've been inspired by two authors, Anne Svetkovich and Zoré Bayatrizi. So even though none of those authors proposes the notion of the injunction to live and to futurity per se, Svetkovich discusses the moral imperatives to stay alive in her book Depression, and Bayatrizi mentions the idea of a life sentence in the title of her book. So in my book, I explained how this injunction to live into futurity is part of a larger normative system, compulsory aliveness, that you referred in your question. So simply put, the injunction to live into futurity aims to impose life and a future on everyone except those cast by dominant ageist, ableist, sanist, capitalist norms as unproductive in our neoliberal economy. So if you are young, are otherwise physically healthy, and specifically if you attempt suicide, emergency services will save you even against your will and your consent. Regarding the concept of compulsory aliveness, I was inspired by the notion of compulsory heterosexuality theorized by Adrienne Rich in the 1980s, and the notion of compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness theorized in disability, CRIP, and MAD studies by scholars such as Robert McCruer and Alison Kafer. I argue that compulsory aliveness represents the normative component of suicidism and includes various injunctions, including the injunction to live into futurity. Compulsory aliveness as an apparatus function through a wide array of tools and mechanisms, or we can call them somatechnologies, such as laws, regulation, attitudes, and discourse. And it translates into what I call in the book the suicidist preventionist script, which represents the dominant response to suicidality, and that could be summarized as follows. Suicide is never an option for suicidal people. As a dominant system of intelligibility, compulsory aliveness masks its own historicity and mechanism of operation, which give life an apparently stable and natural character. Yet this stability and this naturalness stem from performative statements about the desire to live. So by modelizing Judith Butler's thesis on gender as performative, I see the desire to live as performative. Indeed, institutions, social policies, laws, practices, interventions, theories, and discourse shape the desire to live and present it in a similar way to how we sometimes present gender, as if it were a natural, stable, unchangeable desire, whereas in fact it results from norms, discourses, pressures, and practices that remain invisible within a suicidist regime. Reversely, the desire to die is seen as abnormal and pathological, regardless of whether this pathology is identified in the individual or in social political structures. In the spirit of Sarah Ahmed's suspension of the presumption that happiness is necessarily a good thing, in my work, I wonder what kind of new relationship to suicidality and suicidal people could emerge if we let go of the injunction to live into futurity and suspend our adherence to compulsory aliveness. As Ahmed does it in relation to happiness, I'm interested in tracking the effect of the presence of compulsory aliveness on marginalized groups, including suicidal people. And this is important to do because the injunction to live into futurity, like the injunction to happiness, is used to justify the oppression of the most marginalized groups in our society. So in my book, I ask the question, what does it mean in this context to have not only a happiness duty, but also a life duty implemented through a vast array of mechanisms and carceral institutions in the name of cure and care? Compulsory aliveness and its injunction to live into futurity is materialized through what I call suicide prevention violence. And this could be conceptualized alongside what Eujung Kim has called curative violence. That is, a cure that aims to be a remedy, but that simultaneously harm. As curative violence, suicide prevention violence conceptualizes suicidality as nothing more than a problem to fix and cure. So suicide prevention is presented as a magic solution, but this remedy is simultaneously deadly for suicidal people because it prevents them from reaching out for help for fear of experiencing suicidist violence. Suicide prevention refuses to leave any room for suicidality in the life of suicidal people and justifies physical, material, and epistemic violence towards suicidal people in the name of cure. So, while it appears that our societies care about suicidal people, I reveal that through a preventionist script, we are in fact exercising systemic violence, discrimination, and pathologization against suicidal people. And the preventionist script, fueled by suicidism and compulsory aliveness, forces us to take an unaccountable and uncompassionate approach towards suicidal people, unfortunately.
Yeah, completely. And I think it's important. I think that that allusion to Butler's idea of performativity to identify how this becomes so normalized and therefore so difficult, not only to challenge, but just to identify. I think that's extremely important. But I mean, this book, Undoing Suicidism, it's much more than just an academic intervention about suicide. It's also, for yourself, it's autoethnographic testimony of suicidism's harms. So, as yourself, as a mad, disabled, and suicidal trans man, how have your own experiences of suicidism informed your perspective and encouraged you to write this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. My own experiences of suicide as violence inform my work that uses in the book and in general autoethnography and auto theory as foundations for theorizing suicidism. So, in the spirit of various social movements, I offered a few years ago a first suicidal manifesto based on my own experience of suicidality and suicidism. I would say that my desire to write a book on suicide and assisted suicide comes from both a personal and an academic interest. So, on the personal level, I've been a suicidal person since the age of 12. And even though there are periods in my life when I feel I'm feeling better, suicidality never really disappears from my life. And much of my work, such as my work in trans, disability, CRIP, MAD studies, as you just mentioned, is anchored in my various marginalized identities. And my research helps me to better understand my lived experience and to connect it to a broader social, political, and legal context. So I guess that it's similar. My interest in suicide comes from this need to understand my own subjective experience of suicidality and suicidism and to situate them in a larger social political context. In terms of my academic interests, I've been driven in my academic journey to try to understand how various social movements and their fields of study often, despite their best intentions, reproduce forms of marginalization, discrimination, and oppression towards certain people. In this case, I was interested in how social movements, who are usually very keen to put forth the voice of the first people concerned, nevertheless quickly dismiss the voices, ideas, and claims of suicidal people and often reproduce oppression toward them. Also, I was astonished to learn that no concept existed to name the oppression of suicidal people until I coined the term suicidism. So I was disappointed about that lack, and that disappointment was the spark for my book. And my hope is that my work will provide the tools to help us name the suicide oppression, to connect with it with suicidal people, and of course, to build solidarities with other social movements. I would add that generally I'm very open in my work about being a trans, bisexual, disabled, and madman. However, until recently, I remained silent about my suicidality, a form of silencing or self-censorship I discuss in the book through the notion of epistemic injustice and testimonial smothering that unfortunately many suicidal people also experience. In previous publications on suicide, I concealed information about my suicidality to make my arguments more palatable or credible to my audience, as well as to avoid generating a panic reaction from editors, reviewers, colleagues, and readers. Because, like most suicidal people, I was and I'm still am afraid that revealing my suicidality would be used against me to discredit my arguments, taints others people's perspective about me, or trigger a series of negative consequences, such as being hospitalized or drugged against my will. However, in my book, I decided to be more vocal about my suicidality. While I was scared, of course, to integrate those experiences at first, I thought it was necessary to do so because I'm calling for the creation of an anti-suicidist movement. That is a movement by and for suicidal people. And the disability rights movement slogan says, nothing about us without us. So I thought that to build solidarities between suicidal people, as well as to promote what I call a suicidal epistemological standpoint, or in other words, to promote the perspectives of the first people concerned, revealing my own suicidality was necessary. And I believe that this personal tone in my work elicits trust from other suicidal people who often talk to me about their suicidality.
And I think that that is completely the case. After all, I mean, there's so much importance about people who are within these positions to speak about these positions, and hence why there's, as you've described, these kind of normative efforts to try to silence these people or to suggest like they don't have anything to say about their own position. But while you're clear, and you offer so much that's extremely insightful and novel here, while you're clear though that you're not the first, of course, to advocate for the right to die, how do you distinguish your approach, your anti-suicidist approach, from that of the right to die movement, of the social model of disability, and of so many other things, of the social justice perspectives, of the medical model? How does your view differ from these ones?
Yeah, so maybe let me first unpack the various models of suicide and then discuss the right to die movement's position on suicide. So in my book, in the first chapter, I propose a typology of four models of suicidality: the medical and psychological model, the social model, the public health model, and social justice model. So first, the medical model focuses not only on physiological pathologies, but also on pathologies of the mind and the heart. So, for example, mental and emotional health issues. In this model, the problem of suicidality is situated in the body or in the mind. The second model is influenced by the work of sociologists. It's the social model of suicide. And instead of situating the problem of suicidality solely or primarily in the individual, it identifies society and its dysfunction as the culprits. So the social model aims to identify patterns, recurrences, and tendencies between suicidality and social factors such as economic crisis, wars, social values, familial relationships, marginalized identities, or cultural representations to understand and, of course, prevent suicide. Third, between the two previous models we just talked about, there is the public health model, also known as the biopsychosocial model of suicidality. And this model is anchored in public health epidemiological approaches and favors evidence-based research and statistical data. This model bridges individualistic and social approaches to promote population health. It's adopted by many healthcare professionals, and this model currently informs international suicide prevention guidelines and strategies. Very popular model. Fourth, we have the social justice model of suicide that has been put forward by critical suicidologists in the last 10 years or so. In opposition to a psychocentric and individualist approach to suicidality, this model focuses on the collective, structural, and systemic factors that influence suicidality. It's a model that goes beyond the social model and the public health model by not only taking into consideration environmental and social factors that impact suicidality, but also by being politically engaged and committed to social justice. But what I show in my work is that despite numerous differences, these models arrive at the same conclusion, surprisingly. So suicide is not an option for suicidal people. As a result, not only do these models fail to recognize the suicidist oppression faced by suicidal people we discussed before, but they also perpetuate it through a suicidist preventionist script. And one of the most perverse effects of the preventionist script is the silencing of suicidal people. Indeed, they are encouraged to share their suicidal ideation, but are quickly discouraged from pursuing suicide as a solution because suicide remains taboo. And what quantitative studies show is that suicide statistics remain relatively stable and have not improved significantly over the past decades. So despite multiple strategies and billions of dollars invested in outreach initiatives, studies show that those most determined to die, they carry out their suicidal plans without reaching out for help. So in sum, our prevention strategies based on those various models do not work. Of course, I'm not saying that current discourses, policies, interventions, prevention programs, or hotlines based on this preventionist script never help anyone. Neither am I condemning suicidal people who search for cures, be they medical or social. I simply want to highlight how all these models cannot imagine anything other than prevention or the eradication of suicidality to help suicidal people. Indeed, in those various models, as well as in the views of the right to die activists, suicidal people must be kept alive at all costs. And in all these contradictory, but in fact complementary interpretations, suicidality needs to be prevented. And in the few cases where suicide is not seen as a negative action to be absolutely avoided, suicide is presented as a negative right that is a personal decision with which we should not interfere, but certainly not as a positive right that should be supported by the state and society. Importantly, activists in favor of a positive right to die or a claim right limit this right exclusively to the context of disability, sickness, illness, or sometimes old age. And claiming that kind of right to assisted suicide in those specific circumstances is very different than claiming a positive right to assisted suicide for suicidal people, as I do in my book. So in my anti-suicidist and queer crip model of suicide, I propose that suicide become a positive right. And this is what makes my framework and approach so unique, because in consulting more than 2,000 sources while writing my book, I have not found anyone who has ever, to my knowledge, at least in English or French, that is my first language, propose what I suggest here, that is an explicit support of assisted suicide for suicidal people. And I contend that, as surprising as it sounds, allowing assisted suicide for suicidal people might be a way to reestablish the confidence and trust of suicidal people and to break the silence they experience. And it's important to mention that my model of suicide and assisted suicide is meant to complement, not supersede or replace, the fight against systemic oppressions that influence suicidality in marginalized groups. But I can elaborate on my specific approach later in this interview.
Yeah, that's great. And as a way to think through, these four different other approaches, what remains consistent among them is this view that suicide is wrong and therefore should be pathologized and treated as such. Absolutely. But even in the way that suicidal people are treated, how does suicidism respond to people with physical disabilities versus people with mental disabilities? Why are the former, that is, people with physical disabilities, more likely considered for physician-assisted suicide than the latter, that is, people with mental disabilities?
That's a very good question, and your questions point in the right direction because suicidism shapes the responses we offer to various individuals who wish to die. So indeed, there are some forms of death and suicide that are legitimized and others that are completely delegitimized. And the exceptionalism regarding the suicidality of disabled, sick, and ill people in comparison with those regarded as able-bodied, healthy, and sane has framed the binary opposition between suicide and assisted death. And this exceptionalism has long been critiqued by disability activists and scholars. They say when an able-bodied and healthy individual expresses a wish to die, they are characterized as suicidal and targeted by suicide prevention interventions. But when this individual is sick or disabled, there is double standard and the desire to die is recast as rational. Along the same line, I have argued in my work that there is an ontology of assisted suicide. That is what assisted suicide is, and its foundation on forms of ableism and sanism, and its basis in the systemic dismissal of the quality of life of disabled, sick, and ill people. And this ontology creates two classes of suicidal subjects by considering disabled or ill people as legitimate subjects who should receive assistance in dying, and suicidal people as illegitimate subjects who must be kept alive, often at all costs. So people living with mental illnesses occupy a kind of liminal space in the current practices on assisted death, because in some national contexts, they are included in the disabled, sick, ill people category and are allowed to access assisted death, while in other contexts, their presumed irrationality and their mental illness are used as excuses to refuse them an access to assisted death. In my book, I show how suicidism is therefore strongly linked to ableism and sanism. And I argue that suicidism makes some people's desire for death abnormal and inconceivable. In contrast, we legitimize assisted death for those cast as quote unquote unproductive and undesirable based on dominant norms such as disabled, sick, ill, and old people. So in their case, their desire for death is considered normal and rebranded as medical assistance in dying. However, suicidal people's desire for death is cast as irrational, crazy, mad, insane, or alienated, and they are stripped of their decision-making capacity. In other words, from an ableist, sanist, ageist, and even capitalist perspective, people who are seen as unproductive are supported to die in some countries, while suicidal people who are seen as having potential productive futures are excluded from assisted death laws and forced to stay alive. So I ask the following question: why are we offering assistance in dying to disabled, sick, ill, and old people who, in the vast majority of cases, don't want to die but ask for better living conditions and are literally driven to despair by the lack of help, while those who do want to die and determined to do so, such as some suicidal people, are denied any assistance and forced to die alone in atrocious conditions, or literally forced to stay alive, attached to hospital beds. So to go back to your question, I think it's important to mention that in all national contexts that allow some forms of medical assistance in dying, including for people for whom mental illness is the sole conditions of their request, suicidal people are completely excluded. Only people who are physically or sometimes mentally ill can have access to these procedures, and these laws specify that no suicidal person should ever be supported in their desire to die. And even though I mentioned earlier the possibility of offering assisted suicide for suicidal people, I want to make it clear that my approach is radically distinct from that of offering medical assistance in dying for people for whom mental illness is the sole condition of their request. In my work following disability activists and academics who denounce the ableism and sanism underlying current forms of assisted death, I advocate for the abolition of these discriminatory laws that allow assisted death only for quote unquote special populations based on dominant norms of who should live and die. And I would like to see the creation of new laws and policies surrounding suicide and assisted suicide for all adults who have a stable desire to die, including suicidal people. In other words, my approach is not based on a physical or mental illness or a disability diagnosis as the criterion for allowing assisted suicide. I would also add that the ontology of assisted suicide I mentioned earlier contributes to the hierarchization of real and false reason for suicide, leading to the authorization of the real reason and the first suicide, and the prevention of the suicide that would be based on the false reason. As was historically the case for trans people, the centrality of a diagnosis attested by a medical professional is crucial to the procedure's justification. So, as is the case for trans people, who I believe should be allowed to transition regardless of their motivations, I contend that many reasons lie behind the desire to die and that they are all equally valid. So this is also very different from what we hear usually in the Right to Die movement. And the medical industrial complex should not determine which motives and reasons justify transition, including the transition from life to death. However, the pressure to conform to this medical narrative about assisted death is so powerful that even in right to die discourses, the possibility of justifying assisted death outside the dominant script of disability, sickness, illness, madness, and old age is absent. And some, like trans subjects, often forced to frame their need to transition by using a cis-normative script, suicidal subjects are forced to frame their desire to die by using an ableist, sanist, ageist, and suicidist ontological script where disability, sickness, and suffering must be put forth, sanity and rationality must be proven, and of course, suicidality must be dismissed as completely irrational.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, the way that you describe how some subjects are deemed worthy of this treatment, while others, because of their productive possibilities, are denied that possibility, I think is quite telling. And to go back to your last question, this is why you advocate for these positive resources and structures put in place so that people across the board can have access to these services in respectful and caring ways. Now, but throughout the book, you also sketch a very firm link between life and rationality. Now, in our world, to be rational means that you say yes to life. To be irrational, on the other hand, means, among other things, that you say no to life. This poses a fundamental barrier to mentally ill people seeking assistance in dying, because if they are deemed mentally unfit or incompetent, then medical practitioners will pathologize their desire to die as a product of their mental illness. So how does this catch-22 and implicit association of life with rationality contribute to the medical disavowal of suicidal people's perspectives and experiences?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, suicidal people, or people saying no to life, to reuse your words, are deemed based on their suicidality irrational, crazy, or mad. So from the preventionist perspective, a sane person should want to live and should never want to die, regardless the hardships they go through in life. In the case of mentally ill people, there is an additional layer to this interlocked form of suicidism and sanism, since their mental illness is weaponized by healthcare professionals to reinforce the idea that it is irrational to want to die. So their mental health is seen as the culprit of their desire to die, leaving them in this catch-22 situation regarding assisted death, because we know decision-making capacity is central to this procedure. As discussed, by authors in MAD studies, people with mental health issues, or MAD people, are often perceived as irrational and incompetent to make important decisions. Their perceived or actual mental health issues are used to deny their credibility as speaker and their legitimacy in expressing their wishes. So in ableist, sanist, and cognitivist societies, mental competency, decision-making capacity, and autonomy are skewed based on cognonormative standards and very narrow perceptions of what constitutes an autonomous and rational subject. Only those who are categorized as mentally, emotionally, and cognitively stable are deemed competent enough to make crucial decisions about their life and death. I therefore believe that suicidism and sanism are profoundly interlocked, and I argue that the decision-making capacity of suicidal people is denied based on ableist and sanist conceptualization of competence and rationality. Mental capacity is also one of the elements that makes the question of access to assisted death for mentally ill people so controversial. It is the case currently in Canada, but I know it's the case as well in other countries. From a suicidist and sanist point of view, the simple fact of expressing suicidal ideations can lead to one's mental capacity being questioned or revoked, literally, making it impossible to refuse non-consensual treatment. In general, as probably everyone here knows, mental capacity refers to the ability to appreciate information, express choices, and understand the medical implications of treatment decisions. In theory, so, mental incompetence is not broadly attributed to an individual, but determined in specific situation, case by case, based on each specific decision the person makes. In practice, however, some individuals are deemed globally mentally incompetent and treated accordingly, often based on sanist and cogniticist presumptions. In other words, there is a disparity between the law and the application of the law. And suicidal people are among the groups often deemed globally mentally incompetent, along with people living with dementia, for example, or people deemed as living with severe mental disability. But many authors have worked to deconstruct the association between mental illness and incompetence, including in relation to suicidality. While mental illness may temporarily impact decision-making and mental capacity, mental illness does not equate mental incompetence in all situations, of course. And the logic of accompaniment I propose in my work towards suicidal people rests upon an informed consent model that addresses the problem of dismissing suicidal people's rationality as it shifts the decision-making from the gatekeeper's hands to suicidal people's hands. So the suicidal person would be accompanied to make decisions that would then be supported by healthcare providers. And I want to reiterate that there are no good or bad reasons for wanting to die. All reasons are valid if they have been acknowledged and considered through various angles when making an informed decision about life and death through this accompaniment process I suggest. And this is exactly where the current approaches to suicide and assisted suicide fail suicide people currently, because there is no space allowing us to have honest conversations about suicide, which would let us discuss on multiple occasions and with various people the fatal decision we are about to carry out. So when people cannot reach out and discuss such important topics, they are denied in some way the option of making an informed decision. And in my definition, this denial does not constitute care or support, and it reduces people's decision-making capacity.
Absolutely. And that, I mean, that brings us to my final question, which I think will put such a nice bow on this. And that is like in your writing about assisted suicide, you propose a suicide affirmative approach and suicide affirming healthcare inspired by the trans affirmative approach mobilized in trans and non-binary communities. So can you speak to what it means to be suicide affirmative and accompanying suicidal people through their journeys?
Yes, thanks for your question. And it's probably the most controversial aspect of my work because so far people have reacted quite well to the suicidism component, but this suicide affirmative approach is the one to which people react the most. So I want to say right away that while my approach to suicide and assisted suicide is radically different, it's not intended to encourage suicide. On the contrary, I'm hopeful that it will reduce suicide rates. My suicide affirmative approach, as you mentioned, is inspired by trans affirmative approaches to rethink the care offered to trans people, not based on forms of control and gatekeeping, but based on supporting their needs. So my approach is anchored in anti-oppressive values such as intersectionality, self-determination, and informed consent and harm reduction approach. A suicide affirmative approach does not mean pushing suicidal people to suicide, just as the goal of the trans affirmative approach is not to push a person to transition. Rather, it means that instead of trying to cure trans people of their transness or suicidal people of their suicidality, we develop safer spaces in which we can examine their suicidality with them and discuss a wide variety of options without judgment, potential forced interventions, or negative suicidist consequences. My approach proposes to shift from a preventionist and curative logic to a logic of accompaniment for suicidal people to help them to make the best informed decisions for themselves. A form of support that could be life affirming and death affirming. In my approach, and this is very important, the priority is the suicidal person, not life itself. And this shift from prevention to accompaniment empowers suicidal people. Similar to a trans affirmative approach, the suicide affirmative approach offers care and support through an informed consent model, taking for granted that the expert in the decision is the person making the decision. In that sense, I work toward a real accessibility to assisted suicide and not an access based on exclusive criteria that are also ableist, sanist, and ageist. I often say that we are regarding the theorization of suicidism and the rights and recognition of suicidal people, where trans people were regarding trans rights and recognition in the 1930s. But it looks like today, with the current political context, we are back to those years. But anyway, indeed, everything today needs to be imagined, theorized, and transformed, as was the case for trans people when transitioning was not even an option. So my work constitutes a first step in this direction. It allows us to open our hearts, our imaginations, when it comes to the possibility of envisioning suicide and assisted suicide from a different point of view, from the standpoint of suicidal people. My queer crypt model of suicide and assisted suicide is meant to open up our imagination to what our discourses and intervention and practices might look like if we begin to think about suicide and assisted suicide within an anti-suicidist, intersectional, and transformative justice framework. Importantly, my hypothesis is that a suicide affirmative approach, despite this greater accessibility to assisted suicide, might actually save more lives than current prevention strategies. Indeed, rather than being forced to die in secrecy by completing their suicide without consulting anyone due to fear of experiencing suicidist consequences, suicidal people in my non-stigmatizing approach would have the chance to speak freely and to benefit from an accompaniment process to reach an informed decision about their desire to live or die. And numerous suicidal people have written to tell me that they completely agree with my arguments. And at first, people might think that my book, which discusses a politics of death, a suicide affirmative approach, and of course, the controversial possibility to assist the suicide of suicidal people, constitutes a form of banalization of death that would be characterized by pessimism or hopelessness. However, people who take the time to read my book, I know it's long, and take the time to read my arguments, discover a book filled with hope and passion to build a better world for all marginalized groups, including suicidal people. And I truly believe that my approach has the potential to reduce rates of suicidality, particularly among marginalized groups, by opening up channels of communication with people who are currently too afraid to reach out for help before completing their suicide. And even for the small minority who would go ahead with an assisted suicide, my approach aims to offer them a less lonely and violent death and a relational process of dying that would also be probably less traumatic for family and friends than current completed suicides. So the approach I have in mind opens not only a space in which death by suicide may occur, but also a space in which to openly discuss what it means to live with a desire to die. So in that sense, the politics of death I propose represents an ethics of living with suicidal people.
Absolutely, and that's such a perfect place to wrap this up. I think that you captured everything really well in offering not only a template for thinking through the future of suicide care, but also in identifying the forces, the real forces that are inhibiting this development, and thinking through these processes and treating suicidal people like people. As right at their core, of course. But thank you so much, Alex. I think that this was such an important contribution to this field. And just a reminder for everyone that the English version of this book can be found open access with a link in the description. The French version will be released in early May. And in 2026, as we said, you'll be able to find as well a French version adapted to European audiences that's offered through, well, this is in 2026, of course, it's going to be offered through l'édition Belnou. Belnou? Belnou.
C'est bien ça.
Belnou. Parfait. Which you'll be able to find in open access and a print copy in February of 2026. So stay tuned for that. But for now, thank you so much, Alex. It's been a real
Thank you so
honor.
much.
And stay tuned for anyone interested in the French version that you can find actually immediately now on the same channel in the future. From now, whatever. You'll find it. It'll be there. Great. Everyone, take care.